Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the moderator for the next session, Paul Taylor.
Je me permets.
Oh. Good afternoon. I'll ask the panelists to take. I'm Paul Taylor. I used to be Paul Taylor anyway. I'm a columnist with Politico, and I also write about European defence for Friends of Europe, the Brussels think tank. It's a great pleasure to have you here with us for this session, which has been called not En Marche, but En Garde. And we will check whether it's En Marche, En Garde, or maybe En Panne with our panelists in a moment. Great pleasure to introduce to you this afternoon a splendid panel that we've got together. You may find it a little bit German heavy. For once, the elephant in the room is on the podium. So first of all, let me introduce Claudia Mayor. She's a senior associate at the research division of Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, and she writes a lot about European defense, Franco-German defense matters, German defense policy, and so on. Next to her is Secretary of State Thomas Silberhorn, who's just joined the German Defense Ministry in the last few weeks as Secretary of State. He's from Bavaria. He's from the CSU. He is, I'm told, from the pro-European wing of the CSU. We'll test this later on. Welcome. Next to him is Arnaud Danjean, who's definitely from the pro-European wing of Les Républicains, which is not an easy position to be every day at the moment. He's a member of the European Parliament. He's vice chairman of the Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee. He's from France, as you might have gathered. And he was the author and coordinator of France's strategic review last year, which was ordered after President Macron was elected, and which is the basic policy document for French security policy. And finally, last but not least, Ralf Ketzel. He is Senior Vice President at KMW. That's a funny mixture of KMW and KMW, which makes tanks and other military vehicles. And he is, if you like, Mr. Leo II, a former artillery captain who's been for the last 15 years?
30.
30, okay. In charge of the tank programs at Karlsmaffei, as I used to know it in my youth. So we're going to talk about European defence. Has the moment finally come? There's a lot of initiatives out of there, but let me just start by saying you have the possibility to ask questions. You can do that in the old-fashioned 20th century way by raising your hand and trying to catch my attention, or you can be very modern and ask the questions online. You can do that by going to slido.com. The event code is #GLOBSEC 2018. And you are in Danube Space. That's the name of this room. The session runs for 90 minutes, so please keep those questions brief when we get there. But we want to have as much debate as possible. Our participants have very kindly agreed not to give introductory speeches, so that'll leave plenty of time for real cut and thrust and discussion. If we look around Europe today, we've got several factors that are driving initiatives for common European defence. I call them sometimes the four horsemen of the apocalypse. We've got Putin, Trump, Brexit, and Daesh, Islamic State. You could add to that the four and a half horsemen, the Trojan donkey of Erdogan and the instability in and around Turkey. And then you've got a whole range of global issues which wash up on Europe's doorstep. Migration, conflict-driven migration, climate-driven migration, the impact of climate change, cyber security and cyber insecurity, and conflict over resources such as water and energy. At the moment, we have a proliferation of defense initiatives, which we'll talk about today, in and around Europe. Within the EU, we've got an alphabet soup, PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation of 25 member states, launched at the end of last year. Garde, which is the review of defense capabilities by the European authorities. The European Defence Fund just being launched, and which is supposed to use European budget money to fund both research and development and eventually joint procurement of weapons. We have plans for a European cyber security agency, a border and coast guard, lots of things on the European side. How do they fit with what's happening elsewhere? In NATO, we have, of course, since for the last couple of years, since the Russian invasion of Crimea, we have the enhanced forward presence in the Baltic countries. We have the very high readiness joint task force. We have also, and I'm sure State Secretary Silberhorn will talk to us a bit about this, the German framework nation concept that is being developed as well. And then we've got lots of other initiatives, bilaterally, multilaterally. We've got Britain's intervention expeditionary force with the Nordic countries. We've got the Franco-British joint expeditionary force. We've got President Macron's proposal for a European intervention initiative. So no shortage of initiatives, but where will they lead and how can they be brought together? Finally, I would say defense spending is beginning to rise in Europe, and no doubt we'll hear a lot about that at the NATO summit in July, but it's rising more in some parts of Europe than in others, and in some parts of Europe which matter most, it's not really rising very much at all, at least not as a percentage of gross domestic product. So we're going to talk about that as well. Is there, as I think, a big potential to overpromise and underdeliver? We need to talk about that. I'm going to start with Staatsekretär Silberhorn. Do you think, first of all, that we're finally on the way to a joint European defence, or is it just another false dawn?
Well, thank you very much. First, it's really a pleasure for me to be here in Bratislava and to join this GLOBSEC conference. I think it's a very strong political signal to have a security conference in Middle and Eastern Europe. As a Bavarian, as you mentioned, and German, you know that we are hosting the Munich Security Conference, and if this GLOBSEC is going to be, let's say, an Eastern or Central European branch of our defense and security community in Europe, I really appreciate this. Do we overpromise cooperation? Well, defense and security policy has always been at the core of European integration since its very beginning, and indeed there was already a lot of overpromising and under-delivering, but things changed. Since 1990, this is the line we try to draw in our communication in Germany to our public and to our parliament. Since 1990, we all raised a peace dividend from German unification and European integration, unification, enlargement towards East. And this had impacts, severe impacts, on our readiness, on our capabilities. But things changed, at least since 2014, not only with Ukraine and Middle East, cyber, you mentioned all the new threats. So there is a growing awareness of an increasing necessity to do more for European security and to act not only closer at European level, but also to strengthen our European capabilities to act on our own. This is not understood as contradictory to our European pillars and to our transatlantic cooperation. The transatlantic pillar will remain a strong fundament for our security in Europe, but we have to become more European at the same time. And what we are have begun now with 3 initiatives: the coordinated annual review, the thoughts about a new European Defence Fund, and in particular the permanent structured cooperation, is very concrete, also compared with former visions of a joint approach in defence policy. And if you look at the discussion about PESCO, for example, in last year, the discussion was about whether it's possible at all to establish such a permanent structured cooperation. Now we are already debating the implementation of concrete projects. There's a first list of 17 projects, a second list that will be drafted during this year. And I think the chance of this new PESCO initiative is to become very concrete, to define, to identify capability gaps in Europe, and at the same time to find a framework and instruments how to fill these capability gaps with political will and contributions from involved and participating member countries. By the way, this is not a European Union initiative, it's an initiative from 25 member countries of the European
Union. Well, within the European framework, European Union framework.
Within the framework, but with strong binding commitments of the member countries, and the experience we made in Europe that usually we need everybody to adopt joint solutions. This is a club of willing countries, and it's quite big to have 25 willing and capable countries to work together. So I think we are on a good path, not to overpromise, but to deliver very concretely.
Well, let's talk about delivery. Germany is the swing state, in my view. It's the one big economy in Europe that has the fiscal space that could do a lot more if it chose to, but it's not choosing to. Your Chancellor said and has repeated that, you know, we Europeans have to take our fate into our own hands now more, and we can't rely as much on the Americans. I think at one point she also said on the British. And yet, your cabinet has just approved a medium-term finance plan that really says that defense spending will stay stuck pretty much range-bound where it is now. It's today, I think it's 1.23% of GDP. It's going to go up to 1.3%, and then it's going to come back down to 1.23% in 2022. It's nowhere near achieving what you've committed to do in NATO. How can you justify that? A, when you see the strategic need as defined by the Chancellor, B, when you've made the commitment, and C, when you've actually, unlike the rest of us, got the fiscal surplus to do it.
First, it was a heavy debate during our coalition negotiations in springtime, whether to keep the figure of 2% in a coalition treaty or not. In the end, we failed to name it, but we remain committed on a path towards 2%, and this has been explicitly named by our Chancellor this week at our Bundeswehr conference. And also in the Bundestag, just yesterday, she mentioned this 2%. We remain committed to these 2%. At the same time, you're right, we will come to 1.3% next year. In the end, what we achieved during our coalition negotiations was that during the entire legislative period, we will increase our defense budget by 10.2 billion euros for 4 years.
How much of that will go just on extra salaries rather than on equipment?
Well, it will go to 1.3% next year. And my minister already announced, and this is the current discussion today, this week, because we've plenary discussion the first reading of our budget law. We announced we want to get an additional 12 billion euros, but we have also to understand that it's a difference between the relative figures in percentages, and of course, on the other hand, the absolute numbers.
Yeah.
The absolute numbers are increasing significantly since 2014, and they will continue to increase in the years to come. And what we are very concretely preparing now is to achieve not only the 1.3% next year, but the 1.5% until the end, until 2025. And of course, there remains a delta, a gap to 2%, but we are on the way forward. To some extent, I wouldn't say that we became, to some extent, a victim of our economic success, but in absolute terms, this absolutely is the case.
Right.
So,
well, we'll come back to it.
It's not a strategy to run down our economy.
I understand that.
Facilitate the 2%.
I'm sure you understand also that a lot of the extra money which is budgeted in so far is money that will automatically go to pay rises for the force. I'm not saying they don't deserve it, or indeed that you don't need to pay the forces more to recruit people. But
maybe one message is very useful in this regard, because we made a very clear commitment in our coalition treaty for the very first time, and I think it's unique, maybe worldwide, because we said first, additional room of maneuver, fiscal room of maneuver, will be primarily used for our international tasks, including defense including humanitarian aid and development cooperation. Secondly, we want to keep the status we already achieved for official development assistance as well as for NATO expenses. And thirdly, we established a mechanism on how to grow up, because we agreed on using additional fiscal room of maneuver in the relationship one by one for, on the one hand, defense, and the other hand,
development,
humanitarian aid and official development assistance. And this leads to a very concrete collaboration of Foreign Office, Defense Ministry, and Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Defense. These three ministries reflect all the three coalition partners, Social Democrats, Christian Democrats, and my party, Christian Social Democrats.
So now you just need the finance ministry on board. And we're off to the races. Arnaud Danjean, we'll come back to you, sir. Arnaud Danjean, France has been in the front line in terms of intervention outside Europe. It's been obviously involved in trying to fight terrorism and stabilize the large area of the Sahel. It's been involved in fighting Daesh in Iraq and in Syria, both from the air and on the ground. How do you see PESCO in relation to that? Is it a game changer, a nice to have, in irrelevance to the real operational tasks on the ground? How do you view it?
Thank you. First, I would just make a precision. I will speak on my own behalf and not on behalf of the French government.
No
link with the French government,
right.
So it's personal. PESCO, first, I see it as a provision of the Lisbon Treaty, which is finally being implemented. And that's important. We could be more ambitious, we could have different views of PESCO, but at least it is there. It has been put aside for too long. It's a provision which is welcome. But PESCO is just one piece of a broader momentum, I would say. As you mentioned, I think there is a momentum in Europe now for the Europeans themselves to do more for their own security, to develop some more ambitious security and defense policy. But having said that, evil will be in the details. And PESCO is very inclusive. You have mentioned 25 member states. On the one hand, it's very positive because it shows that there is a political will for almost every country in Europe to engage in defense, which was not a done deal a few years, even a few months before. So it's a good sign. It's a good political sign of commitment. On the other hand, it could lead to a watered-down cooperation, I would say, with a lot of projects, with none of them being meaningful enough to be a game changer. So we have to be careful on the way we handle the governance of this PESCO to make sure that we have some meaningful projects, that industrials are on board, because it's very important. If it's only a kind of a top-down approach with very high-profile political announcement, but with no delivery with industrial, it will lead nowhere. So these are some preconditions for PESCO to work, I would say. But we must, of course, see beyond PESCO. And let me tell a very French view. I don't want to be too much caricature, but it's true that from a French point of view, this European momentum is positive, obviously positive, and we do support that, and we do take our part of PESCO, of European Defence Fund, and things like all these initiatives. But we have to keep in mind that ultimately we are also talking about defense forces which are acting, and we do focus a lot on capabilities. It's essential, it's very important. I just hope that we will not lose sight on operations. Operation matters, not just for the sake of operations and intervention. If we can avoid intervention, I think everybody would agree that it's better like this. But in the world where we live, with so many threats around, with such a deteriorated strategic environment, which is a lasting one, we need to be able to intervene when needed. On this, it's a problem of capabilities, yes, indeed, but it's also a problem of, I would say, strategic culture. And on this, we have a lot of things to do.
Sure.
We are far from a common approach on that. We used to say that French and British have a common strategic approach when it comes to intervention, ability to deploy troops, and willingness to project. I think we have to look at the operational side of this European defense policy, because when I look at all the initiatives that have been taken for the last year and a half, European Defence Fund, PESCO, Garde, it's all about capabilities. Once again, it's very important. But we have some operational issues, financing of the operations, effectiveness of our operations, current European operations. We limit our operations to training missions. It's good, it's very useful, but is it at the level required? Is it up to the challenges we face? I don't think so. So financing, efficiency, and also, I would say, more operationally, we have this question of the battle groups, the so-called battle groups, this intervention force, which have never
intervened. Right.
So, and on
these non-intervention forces,
on these issues, there is no progress, and sometimes it's even forgotten in the discussions. You know, when this famous financing mechanism, Athena, we have been talking about reforming Athena mechanism for years. Not a single proposal has come to the table so far. So my message would be that it's very good. There is a momentum, positive steps taken. We have to see the achievement, but do not forget the operational side of all this.
So I know you don't speak for him, but where does President Macron's European intervention initiative fit into this picture that you've given us?
Well, I think it's precisely a very French concern. We are too often seen as a lonely actor when it comes to combat.
Ranger.
Put it I mean,
kicking down doors and taking names.
no, when you visit Sahel now, you have 4,000, more than 4,000 French troops, combat troops. It's not just a stabilizing mission with patrols just to stabilize. It's combat mission, daily. And it's more and more difficult for the French public opinion to understand that we pay this price. And we are a bit lonely on that. But I do praise Germany. Germany has deployed troops. Netherlands has deployed troops. Estonia will deploy troops. We have more and more Europeans coming. So it's gaining pace, and luckily so. But I think to understand why the French are putting so much emphasis on the operational side is also because we are engaged. We are an acting army. It's also because for a long time there has been a reflection in France about who in Europe is able and willing to act ultimately. And so this initiative is precisely about that, to see with our partners who is able and willing to go a bit beyond these capability programs, once again, which are important, but which will not fill the whole spectrum of real defense policies.
So very briefly, if this initiative is successful that the President is launching, you would say that in 5 years' time or in 10 years' time, France won't be alone anymore in going kicking down those doors in the Sahel or somewhere, that there will be Dutch and Belgians and maybe even Germans alongside them in the first entry?
I wouldn't blame anybody, and I would, on the contrary, I would say that we have a lot of support. It's true that when we come to combat mission, which is, I understand, perfectly legitimate for some countries to be reluctant for, but we have a lot of support. We couldn't do what we do without the logistical support of our partners, European partners, American partners, Canadian partners. So we have a lot of support. So I don't want to minimize this. I just say yes, indeed, that when it comes to the hard task, it would be good at some point that more solidarity is shown, but I think it will come, and probably sooner than the 5 to 10 years that you were mentioning.
Okay. Claudia Mayor, you write a lot about these issues, and you've written things in the last few months that have suggested that you think that this French initiative is in some way contradictory or a rival to the PESCO, to the European Union's Big Tent initiative. How do you think they can be reconciled, or can't they? And perhaps addressing Arnaud's point, what do we have to do to get a joint strategic, or more of a joint strategic culture among European countries that enables them to develop capabilities but also operations together?
Two very large questions. I think the first...
don't do small ones.
The first on PESCO and the European Intervention Initiative, it goes a bit back to what has already been said, the initial debate about whether we do a kind of ambitious, exclusive operational PESCO, which was more the French approach, or whether we go for an inclusive integration idea of PESCO where as many countries as possible would join. The logics behind are totally different. The one is we want to improve security in Europe. We want to be able to go to operations. We have a real security and defense interest. That's the French and maybe also the Finnish approach. And then we have the German approach in the age of Brexit and other things to say we need to keep our European house together. So the idea is more to say we need to keep cohesion. We need to keep as many Europeans as possible together. That's more the integration logic. But the two don't really work together. In theory, you can always say it's complementary. In practice, we know they are more or less contradictory. So to kind of putting it a bit too simple probably, but at least it's clearly understandable, the EI, so the French initiative, is a bit what the French would have loved PESCO to be, but they didn't get it. It's small, exclusive, operational. Only those states who are able and willing to really do something. So, and that's why you can actually interpret the European Intervention Initiative in two ways. You can say it's a positive signal to the Europeans, let's get things done. If PESCO works, all is complementary. We get the good industry from the European Defence Fund, we get the good projects from PESCO, and then Europe is stronger. You can also take a negative approach and can say this is disengaging from European solidarity, because you leave all those, you know, kind of slow, institutional, not really performing states, and we play with the big boys abroad. So I think the answer to that question is disengaging from European solidarity, or is it actually doing something real for defense? It's going to be in the future how it's going to be implemented. Where is this going to take us? Is it going to be reconnected to PESCO, as the French hope it might be at some point if PESCO were to deliver? I tend to be a bit cautious. If I look at the PESCO projects, I'm not impressed and I'm not afraid. I mean, afraid of delivery. So that's a bit of a difficult one.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what about the strategic culture thing? Because, I mean, one of the things and one of the reasons why the French are doing this outside, I mean, there are other reasons which we haven't talked about, for example, as a way of binding Britain in just as it's leaving the EU and so on. But one of the reasons the French are doing it is because of this willing and able. And the willing is about strategic culture. The able maybe also a bit, but the able is also about capabilities. So how do we bring the European strategic cultures closer together?
Strategic culture in itself is how a country behaves in security and defense policy. And at the core of strategic culture is how the relationship a state has to the use of military force. And that's a kind of major difference. The French approach to the use of force, the British, the German, the Czech, the Danish approach to the use of force. Plus you have the history of conflict and of politics. What I find really interesting about the French approach is to say we try to build a European strategic culture via operations, so via common engagement. In the past, we always thought we would build a European or common strategic culture by first elaborating a joint white paper, strategy, whatever, starting with the theory, and then at some point we would do operations or something else. Now the idea is to start from the opposite. So start from the practical experience. Don't do the theoretical think tank stuff, but do real stuff on the ground. It takes an enormous amount of time to change a strategic culture. Look at my country. The first out of area, or the first kind of operation in Cambodia took place in 92, 94, whatever. Then came Kosovo in 1999, and then far later came the Balkans, Afghanistan, and now NATO. To change such a major component of a strategic culture, like the use of military force, takes a generation at least. So I think in theory we can always say the closer we grow together, the more we cooperate, the more we go to operations, the more we will forge a European strategic culture. But I think in practice that's almost impossible. So I think we will have agreement on certain events, on certain actions, but we will be very far away from a European strategic culture. And just to finish on that one, I think something which I kind of find a bit cheeky about the French initiative is to say we built a European strategic culture via the European Intervention Initiative with a secretariat in Paris and sending exchange personnel all to Paris. European strategic culture doesn't mean French strategic culture. This is something we should all be aware of.
So it should be done in Brussels with the European Commission's bureaucratic culture?
No, I don't say that. I think that
in Berlin with the parliamentary and pacifist culture?
I think that parliamentary control is not something. Is something that is very valuable. Sorry?
The weather would be better in Italy.
Certainly. I think the idea to. I mean, even if a country, in a country like Germany, we don't all agree on how to deal with military issues. Even in France and Britain or other countries, there's different opinions. So the idea we could streamline 29 countries into one assessment of a crisis in the world is not going to work. We can only find agreement on certain events.
Thomas Silverhorn is itching to come in, so I'm going to give you the floor. After that we can talk about industry, but you in the audience, your moment is going to come quite soon. I'm starting to get some very good questions in on Slido. Please keep those questions coming. Think about what you're going to ask, and obviously, that you'll introduce yourselves, try and catch my eye. You'll introduce yourselves, you'll make it one question, it'll be short, and you'll tell us who it's aimed at. You wanted to come back, sir?
Yeah, I think in missions where we are engaged, we cannot really identify a German parliamentary approach or a French or an Italian. These engagements are based on a joint analysis, and we have a coordinated deployment of troops, whether it's in Afghanistan or in Mali. We went to Mali on French invitation. We've never been there. Now we have 1,100 men and women deployed in Mali. We are in Afghanistan for decades, meanwhile. We are in Kosovo for 20 years next year. 20 years of Kosovarian independence and bilateral German-Kosovarian relations. And we are now on a way to transfer from military presence to civilian development.
Yeah.
And this reflects also the need for a cultural approach or a strategic culture.
Absolutely.
Each conflict, each escalation has a prehistory and has to have a follow-up towards sustainable civilian development. That has to be reflected in our strategic approach.
Yeah, I would love to be able to somehow marry the German global comprehensive approach, which involves conflict prevention, diplomacy, and the follow-up institution building and so on, with the French urgence de l'action, actually going and doing things. If we could marry those two, I think it might be a marriage made in heaven, but I see Claudia's reasons why that's going to take a long time. Arno, you want to come in there?
I just wanted to make a point related to what Claudia said, which is very true. The French should have no illusions that a common European strategic culture will not be a French strategic culture. We have to be aware of that, and otherwise the French would be always disillusioned by the European defense policy. Yeah. We have to be aware of that. We have a specificity, which is our decision-making process in military matters. We have a fast, single, direct chain of command from the president himself. Right. The parliament come with a lot of distance. 4 months after the right. decision has been taken, the parliament can have a vote. So we have to be aware. Yeah. I am perfectly aware, but the French public opinion has to be aware that we cannot duplicate this system for other countries, and we have to respect the culture of and the tradition of the history and so on of the other European countries. I don't think there is such. I mean, there are ways to reconcile things, and exactly what we are now experiencing in Sahel. Yeah. I think the German troops are deployed under UN auspices. So the mandate is a bit different, even if it's a robust Chapter 7 mandate. But I do agree that the German approach, especially the linkage with the civilian approach, development approach, will be very, very useful in Africa. Yeah. And I'm very pleased to see that politically speaking and even strategically speaking, there has been a kind of a shift in the German foreign policy, and there is much more attention paid to Africa, and it's huge. And the French public has also to understand that. The French leaders they have also to understand that Germany has made its way already. Yeah. By sending troops, but not only sending troops, by putting Africa high on the agenda.
Indeed,
it's very
it's got
important.
A coordinator for Africa.
So we have, there is so much things to be done in terms of security or in this southern flank that I would say any help is welcome, whatever the form it takes.
Ralph Ketzel, you've been sitting very quietly out of the firing line so far. So this is your 5 minutes or 10 minutes of fame. You, in a way, embody here on the platform today the possibility of European defence cooperation. Your company, KMW has formed an alliance with Nexter of France, and you're looking to build the next generation of European tanks, armored vehicles. What do you need from the politicians? What will it take to make this work?
First of all, maybe we starting with the point that KMW is already partner in the European defense landscape.
Yeah.
We are the provider for the systems. We have always a cooperation with all the nations, and sometimes we find already a solution of cooperation with different strategic approaches. For example, Germany not employing tanks in Afghanistan and have a lower profile, supported Canada with equipment to show heavy force in the country. The European community were capable to support such an operation by having the similar material from Finland up to Spain and Greece. So therefore we have as KMW a background as a European partner, and we have identified that the big cut in the land forces is between France and Germany, and I believe this marriage is one extreme important thing. We have to address here that our success in the Leopard 2 based on jobs, on projects, on programs, and on the development programs which have to take place. As industry, by ourselves, we are not capable to have such a strategic approach. We need the programs. And that's the reason why we are sitting together with our French partners and discussing solution for Europe to provide early solution. Because if we're looking to the main ground combat system, it's like PESCO projects, they are far away. We are talking about 20 years. It's beyond the operational scenario which we are surfing today. But however, Europe needs today's solutions. So that was the reason that we have approached EDA, the European Defence Agency, and saying, consider all the facts in the past with the Leopard, looking to the scenarios which we have served. For example, the Canadian support by the German government with loaning of tanks. Now they're operating the tank fleet. And such models we need early, because we could not wait and we will not wait only for the development programs, because we have to eat today. We have to give our employees in France as well as in Germany jobs, as well as our international partners, because we have to highlight as KMW, we are already working together with our former partners, whether they are Swedish, whether they are Greeks or Spanish. So we have established a European network of cooperation, and we are really glad and looking forward to find that with our French new partners. And for that, we need solution on a European Union level early for providing material and giving strategic backgrounds and a cooperation. Therefore, any development which is inviting non-NATO, non-European partners to our defense material is critical. We're looking that Korea is entering in the market and definitely will not serve our national European ideas. Yeah? That are the points which we like to address and saying European first, and with the Leopard we have a good model of cooperation which we would like to enlarge and which we can in a partnership decide. But here we need the political support. Last but not least is a subject of having in Europe a common sense how it have to be handled. Yeah. This development and the fleet management and like that.
So rational management of those sorts of the bits that can be done together by Europeans, maintenance, fleet management.
And not even maintenance. Our approach in the EDA was that we're saying, based on our experience with the Canadian, have a pool, like the local fire guard of material, which could provide it for units going in mission. Because I admire the soldiers today cooperating on a level of a battalion and coming with French material, coming with German material, coming. And even if they have the same standard, the material is different. So, and they cannot help each other in a logistic way. And until we have not a hot war, it's not risky. We have the money to run a complex logistic. But with a future approach, they should have, at least at the mission, the same material.
Okay. Yeah, so 2 questions on that, and then we're going to come to the audience and their questions. Firstly, how big a problem for you is arms export regulations and the different ways they are applied in different countries? And there were a lot of issues about that under the last German government before this one, but the same parties are still in government. And secondly, can't we make some progress on having common testing of materials? It's unbelievable that when you produce an armored vehicle, it gets tested in each country, theoretically according to the NATO standards, but by national authorities, and the same piece of kit can pass in Germany and fail in Belgium or the other way around. Why can't we make progress on that, Rolf?
Okay, maybe the situation is not so worse as it sounds. First of all, export, it's a clear subject where we could not really discuss. We know that export is a primate of the politicians to say where we can active. We believe that defense material is a tool for political means. Partnership you can express by providing material. Therefore, politicians have the leadership. It is then a decision of the nation which material has handed over. However, we knowing that export is relevant because we need the scaling. If we have only 10 or 20 tanks to produce, it is not helpful. There must be a common understanding about the size of material to be exported.
Yeah.
And that must be harmonized for common projects. We know the subject with the solution for other German, French products. It can work, and we're looking forward that the politicians find a way to work on basis of existing agreements. Coming to the standards, we have STARNAX, which could be used.
Which
we have
is
the
NATO standard.
NATO standard, the STARNAX. We have procedures also on the various level how it could be transferred if somebody like it. Traditional tests which we have to conduct are in respect to national requirements. They want to see whether it works in the special environment.
Couldn't we at least Europeanize that? Doesn't seem like rocket science. Maybe it is rocket science. That's the problem.
Maybe.
Okay, it's time to go to questions from the audience. I've got lots of questions here. I'm going to call the people for the microphones. There are more questioners than you can shake a stick at, but I don't have any women questioners, and I find that unacceptable. So can I have some women questioners as well? But I'll start with 4 men, because that's what I've got. The gentle with the mustache in the front, then the gentleman over here, then the gentleman here, and no, you weren't on the first list, then the gentleman who's waving his iPhone back there. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Paul. My name is Wolf Langeld. I was, in my last military position, I was commander of the Allied Joint Force Command in Brunson for NATO. And first of all, let me say I completely agree with your main effort on operations, because that is what the military is all about. Training is just the key to be able to go on operations. But my question goes in another direction. If we look back to the last 50 years, we were talking about standardization in NATO. And now we have another word, which is called PESCO, more or less. Today, we still have trucks in NATO with hooks who does not fit to all NATO trailers. So what gives us the optimism that PESCO and all the other things that we have talked about will bring us together in terms of common armament procurement?
We've got you. Thank you very much. Next here.
Thanks, Paul. My name is Jochen Bittner. I'm a journalist with German news weekly Die Zeit.
I thought I recognized it. Hello.
And I'd like to put a question to Mr. Silberhorn, and I'd like to press you a bit on the culture thing, sir, if you allow. The German government, the new German government, has set some preconditions for deepening the Eurozone, for banking union, maybe even risk sharing. And that makes perfect sense to demand, say, proof of a change of fiscal culture in France and elsewhere. At the same time, Germany wants to be part of deepened defense or security union without proving that its own military or strategic culture has changed. Does this make sense?
Okay. Gentleman here in the front, and then over there. This gentleman here first.
Yes. I'm Maxim Khilko, East European Security Research Initiative Foundation from Ukraine, and my question is the following. In this process of building European-owned security and defense capabilities, do you see any prospects, any space for more close cooperation with the partners countries, such as Ukraine, for example? I mean not security guarantees or assistance, I mean the cooperation in the spheres where can be mutually beneficial. Because in association agreement between European Union and Ukraine, we have possibilities for more close defense cooperation, but in reality we see much more close cooperation with NATO, but not with the European Union. Do you see any prospects of development of our relations in security and defense? Thank you.
Okay, outreach to non-NATO non-European members. And finally, Jonathan Isle, who is going to introduce himself as Jonathan Isle.
Jonathan Isle from Britain. I think my question is to Arnaud, whom I'm very grateful for consulting widely when he was doing his study, and to Claudia, who I think brought a very interesting ideas to the debate, this dichotomy between being inclusive and being exclusive, but perhaps more efficient or less efficient in military terms. And I'm going to bring the dreaded Brexit question. Not in general terms, because it's a vast question, but in practical terms. Could it be said that, let us say that the intervention initiative is, as you say, Claudia, perhaps directed more at a Franco-British relationship? Is it that bad? Could there not be a competition, a race to the top, rather than a race to the bottom, in terms, or in organizational terms in defense? And I'm asking it really, it's not a mischievous question. I do understand that there will be reservations about Britain, but is it that bad if the initiative is actually about locking Britain in?
Right, I wondered how far we'd get before somebody mentioned the B word, and the answer is 37 minutes from before the end. Brexit was mentioned. Okay, let's start then with incompatible kit. Who would like to answer that, Rolf, perhaps?
Yes, I can only agree that standard will not guarantee that you'll solve logistic problems. In the end, the need is that you have the same material, a very similar material. Standardization is necessary for key elements which are really interchangeable, ammunition, consumable, and like that. If you have a different type, then it's different. May I allow also to the UK subject to say we had the short time ago the information that they are interested to procure the 8x8 via Orca, so that shows that the British Army is at least interested to keep the linkage to the European Union in a strong way.
Yeah, indeed, and that leads straight in. I'll then go to Claudia to answer Jonathan's question. And thanks for keeping these short, because there's lots of people who want to ask questions. There's lots of questions in the community here as well.
Then I have the great advantage to take also with Jochen's question in to some extent, because I think there's one misunderstanding. I profoundly think that Germany doesn't want defense integration, it wants integration. So closer cooperation, but not with the objective of better defense, deployable, operational, all that kind of stuff, but integration with meaning be keeping all those at one table. And that's, for me, is a kind of contradiction. Indeed, the elegance and the charm of the intervention initiative is to keep the Brits in and to avoid all those Brexit and defense, what mechanisms, third country stuff. But to say we want to be capable to act, whom do we need? We need the Brits, so we avoid all those debates. Can it be a race to the top? It's a bit what I meant. In theory, yes. In practice, Germany is deeply unhappy about the European Intervention Initiative because it understands it as circumventing European institutions which we cherish and value so much.
That's the thing about European defence, isn't it? The Germans are not sure. They both are in favour of it. The Germans are not sure about the defence bit, and the French are not sure about the European bit, right? In a way.
I think it's a bit more complex, but...
Sorry, they pay me to make things simple. Thomas, you wanted to come in?
Well, concerning this European Intervention Initiative, we are in close talks with our French colleagues whether this is understood as an instrument within European structures or outside, and indeed this is a crucial point. Yeah. But we are also on a way on considering how to bring those together who are able and willing to act. And if we talk about European strategic autonomy, of course, this has to be elaborated what it means in practical terms. Just to give you one good example, this is the enhanced forward presence organized by NATO, but in the Baltics. Many partners are on board, including Germany, so I would see it as a misperception that Germany would be reluctant or even obstructive towards acting. No, this is not the case. We are engaged in many areas, in many countries where we did not set any source for conflict and escalation, but where we are. We are even present in Iraq, where we started with development cooperation for, in particular, northern Iraq. So we were spreading not only development cooperation across the entire Iraq, but we are also engaged now with advice and with training for Iraqi military. We would be happy to have partners to join.
So we should expect Germany to be a player in the European.
I think so, yes, and it's not. Of course, we are interested in inclusive approaches. Yeah. This is not only German history; it's also our position within Europe, in the center of Europe. Yeah. We know that we are a bit stronger than others. But we are interested in keeping others on board. The essence of European integration is to implement a partnership approach. It's not the game of the big five boys or whomever. It's a partnership approach between smaller and bigger countries, which is, by the way, missing if you look at other actors in the scene globally.
Arno, can I ask you to address the outreach?
If you allow me to answer this question on culture, fiscal culture, military culture, I'm not a fan of changing cultures, because my experience is this is the hardest way in politics and the way that usually failed ever if you try to change people and change people's behaviors. So we have to take people as they are and to find common ways how to proceed. And PESCO is an instrument in doing so. It's much more concrete than what we saw before in the European Union. It is not, well, it is within the European Union, but it's not driven by the European Union. It's driven by the member states, by 25 member states of the European Union, and I think this is a very strong signal to proceed.
Arno, can you address the outreach question, partners, and why is the EU not better at involving? Can the EU get better at involving partners?
First, for a very simple reason, is that European is very weak on defense. European Union. So we have the CSDP, the Common Security Defense Policy, with a possible partnership with third member, possibly integrated, but it's very limited. It's very modest so far. So that's a reason why, compared to NATO, of course. So that's the first answer. Second answer is, I would say, coming from what we have said until now, we are in a way of integrating more, developing a more ambitious policy. I would say it's a bit of the same with the enlargement process. We have to do more, we have to implement, we have to achieve and to deliver on what we promise among ourselves before reaching out to the others, I would say. I do believe that there are some partnerships which are valuable, and Ukraine is definitely one, but we have so much work at home, I would say, before presenting an offer which would really make sense.
So we have to do our homework first.
Just one word about the Brexit issue and the European intervention initiative and so on. For the French, I think ideally if we could do everything within EU structures, that would be fine. The reality is, would EU structures today, as they function, allow things that we have been doing before? 15 years before, 13 years before, we were able to launch a Franco-German military operation in Congo. Would that be possible today? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Within the EU structure. When we come to this kind of operations today, what we see the minimal thing, training mission. And when you make a meeting in Brussels to see what kind of missions or operation you can do under the auspices of CSDP, the first reaction is civilian mission. Let's do a civilian mission, because it's large consensus, everybody agrees, and everybody's fine for this. Then, can we undertake something militarily? Then you have big difficulties. And if you get an agreement to launch a military operation, then you have the fourth generation. We had this for Central Africa 5 years ago. Central Africa, who did respond to the fourth generation? Estonia and Georgia, by the way. So at some point, it raises question about, does the EU, as it functions, allow a real efficiency for launching operations? So that's why there is this initiative. Also, because we do, once again, ideally, let's work to improve. But what I see now is all the efforts are put on capabilities, much less efforts on institution, financing, decision-making process to allow operations.
Great. Listen, you've been very active online. There is a forest of hands now. So before I go to the next questions from the floor, I found a lady over there, so she gets pride of place. There's a gentleman at the front here. There's a gentleman there who I think I remember from my distant past, and his, and one gentleman here. But before I go there, let me ask one or two of these questions that we've had in online. One of them is about Germany's readiness or unreadiness. We all saw that graphic the other week in the Economist, which highlighted it. Germany has very few combat-ready Eurofighter jets, says Michael Stick of the, I believe he works in the European Parliament. This is reflected across the EU. Is this a symptom of our era in terms of unreadiness, or is this an issue of national leadership? Thomas Solberg, would you like to?
Well, in detail, I could elaborate on figures, whether it's 4 Eurofighters flying or not. A week later, there were 12 Eurofighters flying. We had discussions whether Tornadoes are able for mission or not. In Jordan, I could see a few weeks ago they are in operation. So, but what we see, indeed, there is a lack of readiness. And as I mentioned before, we raised this peace dividend for 25 years. In 1990, at German unification, we had more than 500,000 troops. In the unification treaty between the former allies and the two Germanys in 1990, the Soviet Union insisted on reducing the German Bundeswehr, the German troops, to 370,000. About 10 years ago, we decided to reduce our troops to 185,000. This is exactly half the volume of the maximum volume of our troops from which has been implemented in our unification treaty in 1990 through the Soviet Union. So this is, in practical terms, you can count what a peace dividend means for German troops, and I could continue with our tanks and aircraft and ships and so on. But what we did so far is that with a new white book in 2016 already, we draw the consequences of the adjusted and newly assessed security situation since 2014. Because while German readiness or the volume of German army and weapon systems decreased for 25 years, our engagement in deployments abroad increased steadily since 1990 as well, at the same time. And it was a prioritization on deployment of troops abroad, which meant that
You
the ground,
on maintaining the equipment.
The ground maintenance of our troops paid the price for this. And now we changed this significantly with our white book since 2016, and we said we have two pillars of our army. First is national and collective defense, and the second pillar is international cooperation.
A couple of questions, but
this has consequences, of course, and as I pointed out already, we are increasing our budget since 2014, 2015, 16. But we are not the ones within the German government that have to be convinced. We have to do more. We are the ones who are fighting and striving for increasing our budget and for better equipment for our troops. And of course, we will use, let's say, our international engagement, I wouldn't say as a catalyzer, but to some extent it will help to do the core business, including the very high readiness joint task force of NATO, including the enhanced forward presence in the Baltics and so on.
Claudia, you want to come in. Please keep the answers short because there's so many people who want to.
Very briefly, the state is indeed very sad, but I could also see a positive element of it, because for years the parliamentary commissioner of the armed forces in the German parliament has been publishing reports about the very sad state of the German armed forces, and nobody actually cared about it. So we could have known.
Absolutely.
And we didn't, because if you don't invest in modernization and spare parts and everything, obviously the armed forces are run down. What is interesting now is people pay attention that 6 submarines of 6 are not able to go somewhere. So this actually changes the debate, because we have in Germany a very ambivalent debate. On the one hand, people fear an arms race if we spend into the military, and on the other side, people say this is irresponsible, that nothing of our equipment works.
It doesn't sit with Germans' understanding of how to run an efficient service.
But I think actually talking about the state of the armed forces helps also to explain why we need to spend more to live up to our responsibilities, also to our partners, not only the own.
Arnaud, I've got a question for a Frenchman, and it comes from somebody who might be French, Pascal Amen. How to avoid European defense initiatives becoming a competitor to efforts by NATO?
You know, I'm a bit, how can I say, to remain
cheesed off with being
cool and polite, but when I see mostly colleagues in the European Parliament, but in other forums as well, starting again to point at risk of competition, duplication, and so on. Come on, guys, what are we talking about? We're talking about European initiatives which are only at the beginning, which are very modest, and I don't see any contradiction with NATO efforts. No contradiction. I see a benefit for NATO. What we are undertaking at the European level now is beneficial for NATO because it improves the capability of each member state. Yeah. And I don't see the competition. To me, the whole speech about competition, duplication, which is sounds a bit old-fashioned. You know, I used to listen to this kind of speech from the other side of the Atlantic 25 years ago. It's purely ideological.
Is it competition?
It's purely ideological. Because frankly speaking, I would like to see one example, one concrete example of duplication or competition. I don't see any, be it operational or be it in terms of capability. Okay. I don't see. So let's avoid ideological and theological debate. I see the interest of some people to regenerate this kind of debates, I don't think it fits with the reality. And the reality is European states are making efforts again. We should be happy with that in Washington, in NATO, and in each capital.
Thank you. Short questions, say who you are, who it's for, and don't hang around because we want to get more discussion in. Madam.
Right. My name is Teresa Solin. I work for the Norwegian newspaper Aftenposten. I'm very happy to contribute to gender balance here on this panel. My question is sadly related to the previous question, but albeit in a bit different, coming from a non-EU member country.
Yeah. What about Norway?
I'm not just asking this because the General Secretary of NATO happens to be Norwegian, but beyond that, and also I think Mr. Danjean just answered the previous concern very well. But in terms of signaling, when a European effort is made at strengthening European defense, I'm concerned with what are those possible threats that NATO could not handle? Is there a signal that NATO is no longer sufficient to take care of European security?
Right, and I will add to that my question, which is there an implicit division of labour that NATO's for the East and the EU is for the South, or is that an unacceptable division of labour? But we'll come to the gentleman in front here.
Philip Blond, Res Publica. You can only defend what you can define. And what I think lies at the base of, I think, what Mr. Danjean has talked about, is that we don't have a definition of threats at the European level. The EU's global strategy is very good, I think, post-Brexit on interests and principles, but because it doesn't define threats, essentially there's no agreement about what constitutes a threat, which means people can opt out from it.
So should there be a common threat assessment, and could that be done, for example?
And could that be linked to action? Because then, if you have a common threat assessment, NATO's greatest strength is it's very clear what a threat is.
Right, we got the
Could
question.
Could we do that at European?
Sir.
Martin Michelot, Arrowboom Institute for European Policy in Prague. My question goes on kind of the imbrication between the European Intervention Initiative and the battle groups, which Mr. Danjean, you called for reinforcement of. The question is kind of the sequencing. If there is a situation that requires a quick intervention and the European Intervention Initiative is the framework for this, at which point do you actually see the battle groups coming in with which money, and how do you actually ensure that the fourth generation conference actually happens in a fairly efficient process? Because at the end, I mean, it's not just about having strong and quick effects, it's also about what comes afterwards, and that's what we've learned from European defense today.
Unless I'm going blind, that's Sandy Vershbow back there.
Yeah, Sandy Vershbow, former NATO Deputy Secretary General, now at the Atlantic Council. First of all, I don't work for NATO anymore, but I would say that I see PESCO and these other initiatives as a potential win-win. I think it is important to be transparent and ensure that the goals that are being set on the EU side are consistent with NATO's defense planning targets. There's not enough resources to afford to either duplicate or create redundancies in one area and shortages in another. But I wanted to come back to this issue of third country involvement in PESCO. I know how the French Intervention Initiative is a way around this issue, but let's talk about the third country stuff. Wouldn't it be in the interests of the participants in PESCO, or the interests of the European Union, to have a bit more flexibility than seems to be on offer right now for the participation of non-EU countries, not only in operations, which I think can be done, but also in procurement? Wouldn't it be good to create opportunities that would allow British defense industries to continue to participate in joint projects, but also, in some circumstances, American companies, or Canadian companies, or Norwegian companies? Perhaps they would have to have a minority stake if part of the objective is to boost the defense industrial base in Europe.
I'm glad you've asked that question, Sandy.
It's legitimate, but a rigid exclusion, I think, will create political rifts that are unnecessary and would actually deprive the EU of some potential contributions from non-EU countries.
Yeah. And I think fear of exclusion by the American defense sector is one of the reasons why Arno is here.
Maybe an exaggerated fear, but it's a fear.
Right. Okay. So we have, I think, coherent questions there. Thomas, you want to come in first?
This PESCO initiative can be and should be developed in a way that third countries can be involved and integrated. And it's on our agenda to adopt regulations for third country involvements by the end of this year. But all these concerns about you mentioned here give a strong evidence of your belief in a strong PESCO. And maybe your concerns are even stronger than the belief of the Europeans that this PESCO might be successful. So these strong concerns send the message to me that you believe, those who have concerns, believe in a very strong PESCO, and the European engagement in implementing the PESCO should not be weaker than your concerns and your belief in a successful PESCO. To this question to NATO, all the European Union member countries are members of NATO, so I don't see any contradiction at all. This
Not
is
quite, but
for
most.
me it's a more Sweden. Okay, I see
Sweden,
Austria,
Finland, Malta,
Finland.
Cyprus. There are
yes, of course,
Austria.
but the broad majority of EU member countries, sorry, are members of NATO too.
A lot of overlap.
And I don't see a contradiction at all, because whether it's France or Germany, what we are doing within the European Union, we do it as member states not only of the European Union, but also as member states of NATO. And again, these concerns show to me that you believe in a strong PESCO, but this is what all the NATO member countries always urged us to do in the European Union. So we are just beginning to concretize our steps towards a more integrated and coordinated European Defence Union. It's made very clear, it's made more concrete than before, and I think this should be appreciated also as a contribution to strengthen NATO and not to weaken it. There is no intention at all to weaken NATO.
We have
It's,
a Franco-German
a
axis
stronger
on this point.
European pillar of NATO, of course, is an asset, is a benefit for NATO too.
Ralph, you're itching.
Yeah, I like only to address that in cooperation for development programs, referring to Leopard, we have already certain nations included, Canada, Sweden, Switzerland, which working excellent together, and also the question concerning the threat analysis. There's no divergence. And one of the key points which we're facing now with the main ground combat system is to have a common threat analysis.
Right. I was going to put this to Claudia, actually, and then come to Arno for the question about, is there a division of labour, NATO, East, EU, EII for the South, or would that not work? But first of all, Claudia, do we need a common threat assessment? Should that be the next step after we have a security strategy? I put this question to Natalie Tocci, who wrote the security strategy for Federica Mogherini, and she said, God, no more strategy documents, let's just get on with doing it. Do we need a common strategy? A threat assessment?
The interesting bit is we have a NATO strategic concept which is outdated because it still considers Russia as a partner. And
remember those days?
We still agree in NATO on what to do in terms of deterrence and defense. So I think it's nice to have a paper, but in the end a paper is always something which helps us to reflect, but is something where we can step aside in case we don't agree anymore. I think it's very important to have a conversation in Europe, what do we fear, but we will never agree on that. If you're in Eastern Europe...
But isn't it good that even, perhaps almost like going to the shrink, wouldn't it be therapeutic for us at least to be having that conversation?
Yes, of course.
Produce an outcome.
But I think we should be aware of thinking that if we have that conversation for 3 years, we would agree. It's the same like for strategic culture. We will not. It's good to understand why the French worry about the Sahel, and it's important to understand why, say, the Estonians worry about Russia.
Yeah.
But the end should not be to try to find whatever compromise or one position. We will not find it. It's important to understand why what matters to the other. And I think what is particularly important to understand, and that's actually is progress in Europe, that defense matters again. And this is what we forgot a little bit because we went down into the details.
I think we should have it. We should do it more in our parliaments. I say to the French, why don't you send the head of the DGSE that Arno used to work for, the External Intelligence Service, to the Bundestag once every 3 months to meet with the Defense Committee behind closed doors and tell them what France perceives as the dangers, and then have somebody from the... I think we can't all hear you, sir, but I think we've got your point. Arno, what about the sort of division of labour question?
Before that, if you allow me, just one word on the question on the third countries. I think it's less related to PESCO as such than to the European Defence Fund. We are in the process of adopting the rules. The Parliament has voted, and now it's a trilogue going on with the Commission and the Council on this. I think we'll end up with a text which allows participation of third country firms, and I think it's welcome. We want to be as flexible as we can, but we have to keep in mind that it's the beginning of the project. It's European taxpayers' money for 1.5 billion per year. I don't think this 1.5 billion per year is critical for the US defense industry. It won't put the US defense industry at risk. Let's be clear. So sometimes I have seen some lobbying action a bit disproportionate compared to what was at stake. But I do understand that we have to open to Brits, to the US, to Norwegian, to third countries, allies, and they will be welcome, and we will find the provisions and the modalities to do so. But we have also to make clear to our public opinion that there will be, for the first time in history, which is a big change, European money from taxpayer money invested in defense, in European defense. So it has a political meaning as well. So we will find the right balance, I think. On the share of labor, well, to be honest, in principle, there should not be, a division of labor, a strict one. But look at the reality, and let's be pragmatic. When we face Russia, it's all about deterrence and collective defense. So it's entirely in NATO scope. And I don't see EU in the defense matter. I don't tell in diplomatic terms trade issues and so on, but when we talk militarily and defense-wise, it doesn't make sense. EU has not this prerogative to have a deterrence policy towards Russia in the military terms. So it's NATO, basic job. And you have a country like France taking part in EFP. We have sent troops in Estonia with the Brits. We have sending troops in Lithuania with under German command. I mean, we are taking part in this. So just to lift the suspicion that we are only taking care of the South and we are only interested in the South and we are not interested in EU, in NATO things and so on. No. And it's clear also that when it comes to the crisis management on the southern flank, NATO is not welcome everywhere. We have to admit that. I mean, there are some partnerships, there are some places where you can put a NATO flag, not everywhere. This is the way it is. And I think the EU format, or an ad hoc format sometimes, is more convenient for some countries. And it's also more, I would say, up to what is needed in terms of comprehensive approach. Civilian efforts to accompany sometimes the military and security efforts. So I do see the EU tools more fit than the NATO ones when it comes to some crises in some regions. But I wouldn't put, a clear-cut division of labor. I would be very pragmatic on that. Once again, and sorry to be so general, but there are so many security challenges around us. there is space for everybody to play its role.
I've got time only for one more question, and I'm very conscious of the fact that we don't have any panelists from this Central European region. So if there is one Central European who would like to ask a question, then you are my preferred candidate. If that's not the case, then the next person on my waiting list was the gentleman at the front here who's been waiting a long time.
Bart Shevchuk at the European Commission's European Political Strategy Center. Thanks very much for a very enlightening panel. I wanted to add a little bit of historical context to some of the defense spending debate. If you look at the levels of the past 70 years, it's actually quite striking that for Europe in general, Western Europe, and also for Germany, France, and Great Britain, there was steady increases in defense spending between 49 and 89 or 1990. And that it's actually been over the past 28 years that you've had this systemic decline, and only, you know, current levels reaching something around the levels of 2000 in aggregate terms. And so the question is, especially for Mr. Silberhorn, following up on Ambassador Ischiger's point earlier that, you know, we really need to make the debate easier in Germany to help those who are in favor of increased defense spending persuade their colleagues. Where is the, you know, what are the main things that other actors in Europe, partners in the United States, elsewhere, could do to help with your debate? Because it's clear that at one point, you know, Germany and other European countries were spending a lot more.
Right, we've got the question. Thanks. Sorry, we're really, really tight on time. Thomas Silberhorn, why don't you start with that one, and then we'll just ask each of the panelists for a closing word, but it really will be just a word.
Well, if the question is how you can help us in our debate to spend more money for others, I would say there is no help. Because this is the overall expectation we are confronted with. And we'll come to the time at which we have to prioritize and see what is possible and what is not. So take the discussion on the EU budget without Britain. The expectation from the Commission you are working is that we keep the budget of the European Union despite a possible Brexit. We'll see how far we can go. But my impression is no one can simply substitute what the consequences of a Brexit might be. This is only one piece in this broader picture, and in this context of budget, we have to keep our European frameworks for national budgets, which will be successful this year.
Some of us have more space than others.
Well, my simple experience is there is always money, but there's always too little money. So in the end, it's a question of prioritization, what to do. And in this context, I already told you, we agreed on a clear prioritization for international tasks in our coalition treaty, but it will be hard to implement it word by word. But the results of the negotiations are not bad. It's really unique. For the very first time, we have this prioritization in our coalition treaty, binding for all coalition parties, with a clear way forward for increasing our budgets, both for defense and for development cooperation.
Thank you. Ralph?
Yeah.
Sorry, you've been shortchanged in time, but...
Definitely, we have to develop a European vision which is not only related to the long-term perspective, that we are capable to provide material to this special task, battlefield groups, which allow to cooperate, and not that we are behind the time compared to any other international groups.
Yeah. Arnaud?
Well, maybe a bit provocative conclusion. There is a momentum, undoubtedly. In Europe, defense matters again, I would say, and it's welcome. My fear is it might be reversible, because to some extent, my fear is that a tweet from Trump has done more to prompt the European together on defense than a real consideration of the strategic development around us. That means that at some point, a lot of people, European leaders, some nations would be happy to come back as business as usual. And if it happens that situation stabilize somehow, people would retreat to the former attitude, which is, well, we are under
so you're rooting
US,
for a
US
second
umbrella
Trump
forever.
term, right? So that
no need
European
to matter and to be concerned. So why do we make such an effort? We need a sustained effort. We need to deliver. So it's a long, I would say it's a long-term commitment.
Yeah.
And I hope it will sustain. I'm not sure it will. I hope it will.
Thank you. Claudia.
Taking the point that Arnaud just made a bit further, I wonder what it takes to make the European really get serious about defense. I think we had a little wake-up call with Russia, we had a little wake-up call with Trump. But if I look at my country, we woke up a little bit, but there is still space for improvement. If we get the budget which is currently debated, we will not be able to modernize and equip our armed forces as we promised it in the White Book. We will not be able to carry on our European cooperation and what we promised our partners to do. So the question for me then is, I don't care about the framework, if it's EU, NATO or European Intervention Initiative. The question is, what does it take us to take defense really serious and to make it really matter? Because in the end, defense is about protecting what we have constructed in Europe. And I find it always fascinating that we in Europe almost organized and did everything in the European Union except defense. And in the end, it's about protecting our way of doing things in Europe. And we should care far more about it.
Thank you. That's a very fitting conclusion. It's been a very rich discussion. I think we all agree that a lot rests on the shoulders of Thomas and of his government, because Germany is the big swing state that can make a difference, and that there's room to move. Before I ask you to thank our speakers, I just have to impart one piece of extremely important practical information. If you're lucky enough to have been invited to the GLOBSEC cocktail party this evening, buses leave from the front of the hotel at 19:45. Be there or miss your bus. The first session here in the Danube space tomorrow is at 9 o'clock sharp, and that's on adapting NATO's strategy to the new threats it faces. I think we warmed up well for that. Please now join me in thanking very much our panelists for a very good discussion.